Okay, the premise is simple, detectives. What if you could play Pokemon online and cooperatively with your friends or others? Imagine other players running around as you, your creature of choice, tagging behind you, continue traveling around and looking to be the very best and the one who catches them all. Well, if you are someone who grew up playing or watching Monster Hunter or taming games like Pokemon or even Digimon, you have been wanting to see these games venture into the online world, and in more ways than just limited areas or modes, but actually featured in a fully functional online game, whether an MMO or an online RPG. How many times have you been standing there in the shower thinking, what if I could just play a Pokemon game and catch them all with friends online? Just me? Okay, I'll live with that. But although Digimon actually went online virtually, Digimon Masters Online, Pokemon, the much more popular IP, and arguably the most popular one in the world, never did, much to the chagrin of its fans. Well, this video isn't about those popular IPs I've been referencing. No, it's about a little company that dared to take monster taming and battling online, in a serious way, really, for the first time. Temtem, developed by Crema Games and published by Humble Games, would first launch into early access in January of 2020, and then fully launched 2 years later, September 2022 on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and even the Nintendo Switch. Featuring a fully cooperative single-player campaign, and braving the virtual space for the closest thing to a Pokemon online game for the first time, Temtem was a fun splash of colors and new monsters or Temtems to learn about, catch, and master. Temtem was initially built on the idea of being massive, but over the years the scope and plan would seemingly shift, up until Crema Games would outright declare not having a desire to continue development for the online game, dubbing it complete, which they would announce in March of 2024. Temtem is a perfect case for us on the Death of a Game series, especially a Pokemon and Digimon loving nerd like myself. The Death of a Game series, of course, is a series about chronicling the largest contributing factors for a particular game or company's death, whether that be outright failures, eventual ones, or grand successes that just couldn't outrun time. Utilizing a timeline of events, we are able to find the best clues and bits of evidence that inform us what the largest reasons for a game or company's death is, or shifting towards that status. At the very end of the video, this all culminates in the final deduction, which is the super cool moment in the detective films where you, or I in this case, autistically break the entire case down. Now, don't worry, I know this because, well, I'm autistic and a detective. What a cliche. Well, detectives, there is a lot to uncover in this Pokemon-like case, and it's the closest thing we have to covering this type of game online virtually. That makes this a special episode, especially because I have a bone to pick with Crema Games, as I'm sure many other dual gamers who first played Pokemon on Game Boy and virtual world games as well. Temtem was so close, but so far away. I would like to welcome this video's sponsor, Girls Frontline 2 EXILIUM, the official sequel to the mobile game Girls Frontline. Girls Frontline 2 EXILIUM is a brand new 3D strategy RPG available for both mobile devices and PC, featuring a highly detailed anime art style based on the next-gen rendering technology. The player takes on the role of a commander, leading tactical dolls, known as T-Dolls, through contaminated zones to battle enemies and complete missions. As you progress, more factions and storylines will unfold. Outside of combat, you can customize your T-Dolls' weapons and outfits in the refitting room, or interact with them in the dormitory for a more immersive experience. With the recent update for Girls Frontline 2 EXILIUM, there are new dolls like Springfield, Peri, and Faye, and their exclusive weapons, outfits, and weapon skins. You even have a limited time discount for the new outfits, such as Springfield's new outfits, Queen and Radiance. Springfield is the first outfit to feature a 3D main screen wallpaper, and commanders can even interact and dance with Springfield now. All skins return for a limited time with a skin discount voucher. You can get 40 free pulls, and you can unlock a free Elite Faye doll by participating in the game's event, Radiant Spirits. Want even more? Join community events like Zucchero Creative Hub or Cafe Cat Contest, and you might just win some generous rewards. If you would like to find out more about the game, Girls Frontline 2 EXILIUM, please check the link in the description or scan my QR code on the screen to download the game now. Or visit the Steam page on screen for Girls Frontline 2 EXILIUM and begin playing the game now. The story begins with the humble beginnings of Crema Games, a Spanish Madrid-based indie gaming studio. Crema was actually founded back in 2009, but got their initial popularity and success through mobile gaming. This was started with the success of Instant Buttons, which received over 20 million downloads and shifted Crema Games to mobile gaming development, where they would then develop Oh My Goat, another successful mobile game followed by multi-platform FPS roguelite Immortal Redneck. What? This $4 moderate success would give Crema Games the confidence to soar even higher, which they would do, with the idea that consisted of concepts and features people have been wanting to see in the mainstream gaming space for ages, and thus, it had high expectations and a lot of hype whether they wanted it or not. May 2018 would be the announcement of a new Crema Games game dubbed Temtem. Temtem was a play on the nostalgia and classic Pokemon formula, promising an adventure full of tameable or catchable creatures called Temtems and a world full of NPCs or tamers that you could compete against, including challenging bosses located inside gyms, or dojos in the case of Temtem. The combat was unique in some aspects, starting with the fact that the game was focused on 2v2 tamer battles and the fact that stamina existed in the game, which was a mechanic that kept you from just spamming the same moves over and over again, lest you actually overexert your Temtem, which would make them less effective. The Temtems are also all full dual types too. Everything else is pretty comparable to Pokemon on the surface, with unique types for each Temtem, and the ability to catch and train them, and an art style that's, well, quite approachable. The comparisons to Pokemon were always going to come, because Temtem didn't shy away from them. Sure, there were some differences, like Temtem and the fact that you can catch them with cards instead of, well, Pokeballs, but the core ideas were all there. The difficulty would be outperforming the pioneer of the formula, and a 20-plus-year-old franchise with dozens of games. This is alongside a massively popular anime that had a number of movies alongside it, and different series even after that spawned from it as well. If Temtem wasn't unique enough, the comparisons to Pokemon, while cool and helpful at first, would actually turn toxic and quite negative. First, for Crema Games, their modest $70,000 ask for a Kickstarter would be met, and met easily, reaching a whopping $500,000 instead. But before we move on from the initial Kickstarter, there are some keys we must cover concerning a Kickstarter first, as these keys are going to help us later on in the case. First, we have Crema Games describing Temtem as a massively multiplayer creature collection adventure. Now obviously this genre doesn't exist due to it being so niche and well underdeveloped, but the idea is obviously trying to invoke ideas and feelings of massiveness, which is only involved in one style of virtual world and thus game, the massive variant of virtual worlds, also known as MMORPGs. The problem being, and you could tell this from the alpha footage even, Temtem wasn't massive, and it wasn't an MMORPG. No matter how much they would make the game grindy in ways, that would never fix that. Not only was it being modeled after a Japanese game and IP, which is a market that doesn't even make MMORPGs besides arguably Final Fantasy XIV, it was featuring a similar world system to the OG and pioneer of the ORPG industry in Japan, the same one that basically formed the industry for Japan, and thus the virtual world market there, Phantasy Star Online. PSO, as it's often dubbed, was based on channels that you could select, and each map and instance was then fairly limited in the amount of players that you could play with due to the structure of the game. Still, it would allow for players all over the world to play together, enjoying what would become known as the ORPG or Online Action RPG market, or PSO-like. The reason this is relevant, and I've been banging this drum for decades, is if you don't properly qualify and classify a virtual world, people will just be misled about it, or let down with their experience. People who expect massive amounts of players when playing Japanese online RPGs are just going to be let down, because it's not what the design in those games are focused on. You're barking up the wrong tree. Crema Games from the beginning did little to dissuade the MMO comparisons, and thus, with that, came expectations of large form content and a consistent stream of it too. Because it's nice when you get the benefit of using the name and tag, right? The popularity and coverage. But bad when people start asking questions, like wait, why isn't this game as it's described? There was nothing wrong with Crema Games describing their game as an online cooperative, focused creature taming game. I mean, that's literally what Guild Wars 1 called itself, without the monster taming parts of course, and that was effectively the West's answer to Phantasy Star Online. But Crema Games failing to understand the virtual world market made them essentially promise fans a mixture of both a massive one and the more production, front-loaded, and combat and shiny stuff focused, smaller online RPG variant that was so popular in Japan. Now to be fair, Temtem also clearly states on its Kickstarter it was trying to be less of a big online game and focus more on cooperative play. But talking about being massive with a co-op focus is a bit of a contradiction. That's why Guild Wars 1 never tried to market itself like an MMORPG. Instead it called itself a co-RPG, which literally translated to cooperative RPG. Temtem had the DNA of this built into it. But also, and this was noticeable even in the playable alpha for certain pledgers, where players could notice that Temtem was going to feature some common MMORPG aspects, like tough progression, a focus on the economy, but the divided focus for the game would likely end up making things a bit more difficult for the inexperienced, small development team, especially when now they needed to be good at understanding two different genres and combining them together effectively. But there was another issue with the Kickstarter before we push on. When explaining their reason for Kickstarter, Crema Games would state that although they had been entirely self-funded before that, they primarily wanted to go to Kickstarter for the community creation reasons, wanting to have an open development, which I actually think is great for virtual worlds. Problem is after this Kickstarter, they would actually grab a publisher and Humble Bundle, who they would cite would allow them to obtain potentially more options for publishing and allow them to bring the game to new platforms. This is a problem because Kickstarter is selling the community as the central idea. They are the biggest voice behind the funding of the game after all. That's really the beauty of the platform, especially for virtual worlds, at least ideally. But now suddenly you have another person more important than them, which means that the Kickstarter backers are being kind of like pushed to the back and kind of misled. They would think that their voices were important and would be heard first, but immediately after a successful Kickstarter, and Temtem would have a publisher. The final bad thing about the Kickstarter situation was that Kickstarters technically weren't really enforceable, as we've talked about before, meaning we see tons of projects basically skate being called failures and having to return their funds. Worse, all Crema Games had to do was deliver what was promised, and then there were no further guarantees after that they had to satisfy. This could be seen in how the game was originally set to launch into early access in September of 2019 according to the Kickstarter, but wouldn't launch until January 21st, 2020 on PC and PlayStation only. This is honestly still pretty impressive, all things considered. When compared to most early access games, they can take years and years to come out. But early access, oh god. So you have a publisher, got crowdfunding, and now are using like an early access funding process. The problem is that means that buyers on Steam are now separate from your Kickstarter audience. They have different desires, and you still have that publisher to satisfy. But to be fair, Crema Games was only 20 developers. That's quite the small development team looking to be the first one to break monster taming into the online world, especially on PC. And the perfect size developer to use early access, to be fair. Their ability to launch a virtual world period and sell 500,000 copies in just no time was nothing short of successful. But often in the virtual world space, and featured on the Death of a Game series, we see games that soar to great heights, starting from humble beginnings, but unable to outrun the immense success and expectations they would often generate after that. This is how, on top of how difficult it is to maintain a game in the most difficult and complex gaming genre that is virtual worlds, that's the thing with virtual worlds. The audience, whether a massive one or not, always had the expectation that things were gonna keep coming and getting bigger. Just like my ex-girlfriend. I personally think that developers can avoid this by designing end states for their world in mind from the beginning. But you could always just try to continue to slowly update the game too, depending on the return on the investment obviously. Look no further than games like Lineage 1 or MapleStory 1, which honestly make more money than the majority of virtual worlds today, and are both like 20-year-old games. Single-player games with co-op online don't really have to worry about this expectation though. But although Temtem featured a single-player campaign and was completely playable co-op, the game beside that was actually always online, and thus came with more complications and expectations. Easy comparison for Temtem is actually Let's Go Pikachu, which would sell a whopping 15 million copies and was and is essentially the closest thing to Temtem from the Pokemon franchise. Even just visually. LGP featured cooperative play with its single player, which was honestly like a first revolutionary thing for the Pokemon franchise. The thing about Let's Go Pikachu though is that you never have to worry about the game not being playable because it's not online. And there aren't any expectations that the game is supposed to have more content continuing to come out, even if it sold 15 million copies. Had Temtem just been designed like this, it wouldn't have had this negative reception after the cat was let out of the bag, capiche? But with that comes higher standards of making a better single-player game, to be fair. And I think that this difference can be seen when comparing the two games, which probably had, pretty big budget differences. Look at Let's Go Pikachu. It just seems far better put together, has a more believable world both in how it looks and functions, and it's just better polished. Meanwhile, Temtem has like cool colors, but they're almost like randomly thrown in there just to spruce up environments and don't really have like a rhyme or reason. And the cities and villages feel the same way. LGP also has much better character models, where the ones in Temtem kind of look like generic slop by comparison, I think. So it really depends on what you are looking for, and how you can execute it ultimately. But if you end up not making a focused game, there's going to be consequences. While Temtem's story mode would boast an impressive 20 to 40 hours of play, depending on your skill level, it would only launch with 4 islands, and would deliver the promised 2 more islands totaling at 6 under 2 years after its launch, starting with the Sipanku Island, which would then add a new region to travel to and discover, and of course, new Temtems to tame, specifically of the electric type. The most MMO-like feature to come from the update and hit the game for the first time was easily the mythical layers, which were essentially in-game raids of sort, where you could team up with 2 to 4 other players and take on a series of challenges. The catch was that these challenges were largely completed solo, and essentially required your team to perform well and gain the jewels required, the currency of the dungeon, to take on the mythical creature at the end of the lair. And if you succeed, you can then get access to an egg that you then can grow that said mythical creature. This makes it quite lucrative, but it's a bit strange that the endgame content, even if it's group-based, is not really group-based. And stranger, when you spend the whole campaign training up Temtem and you don't really even use them in the endgame content besides re-fighting the same old dojo leaders. And don't get me wrong, the dojo concept in Temtem is probably more fleshed out in some ways than the gym concepts in Pokemon, but at the same time, they're not necessarily better. And then of course you have to remember that whole 2v2 focus. That was like almost Pokemon-like, but not quite. It just spoke to a mixed direction of the game. With each island and region added was also added more story, which would finalize with the final island added to the game, Arbory Island. Arbory would add a whopping 31 new Temtem and include 2 major cities in Properton and Lockburg. Honestly, Sipanku and Arbory were great updates and added new story content and Temtem to the game. The problem would be, seemingly after the game's launch, these sorts of updates would completely evaporate, but not the expectations of them continuing to come for the audience, which would create a major rift between the community and Crema Games. The full launch of Temtem would come 2 years after it first entered early access. Temtem would get rather favorable coverage from gaming media too, being seen as a game with a lot of potential, and the closest thing that people could play to a Pokemon online game. Scoring a 73 out of 100 on aggregate review website Metacritic might seem low, but review outlets, like we will cover shortly, like Game Informer, were quite positive about the game overall. Before we get to the reviews, as we always do, let's talk about the biggest controversies for launch for Temtem, and what the new 1.0 launch version brought to the table. Starting with the Nintendo Switch launch. This version of the game was, and still largely is, the worst version of the game. That's because, for whatever reasons, Crema Games had difficulty porting to the platform properly. This could be seen in the horrid performance in the game, and frankly, the inexcusable visuals. I mean, remember, Pokemon is almost completely built on the Nintendo platform alone. Crema Games having a poor showing there was consequential due to this. Compare Temtem on Nintendo Switch to Let's Go Pikachu, and it seems like LGP was made years ahead, meanwhile Temtem came out after. The next big controversy was considering the inclusion of a battle pass. This was on top of the game now costing, due to the inclusion of the 2 new islands, $44 in total. Players didn't like the idea of a full box price game also having a battle pass and microtransaction currencies, especially when the battle pass and cosmetic system largely functioned on FOMO and had a rotating system where certain content would then become available. While I don't have an issue including revenue sources in a virtual world, Temtem at this point only had layers with groups and digi-layers, which were like duo layers to constitute multiplayer content. That wasn't just playing the main story co-op. What exactly was the Battle Pass going towards, if not new content being promised or supposed to be promised, and continued support and updates? Well, as we will find out later, it wasn't used for that, apparently. New with 1.0 was the Tamer's Paradise Zone, which was essentially the battle frontier from old Pokemon games. Brought back since some of the later Pokemon games were lacking it, which was kind of a good idea. But Tamer's Paradise is sold as this in-game zone of sorts, and while it does offer some multiplayer content, it's primarily a zone for checks notes, more single-player content. The concept of a game that focuses on 2v2 battles makes it seem like playing with other players would be the norm, but somehow the norm became 2v2 of your own Pokemon. And worse, while 2v2 is a cool concept that many of us Pokemon fans were happy when we got the chance to play it in the series, it was just that. We were just happy temporarily. It was something cool to try sometimes when you would team up with somebody like your rival or somebody else. But designing an entire game around it was basically making a core fundamentally different combat game to Pokemon, which was questionable if it was worth it and if it was even wanted. Because while you might say, well, Temtem's just Pokemon on PC, if it's focused completely on 2v2, is it really? Anyway, what about the critical reception for Temtem? Game Informer would rate the game an impressive 8 out of 10, where they would state that Temtem may look like a copycat on its surface, but its deviations from the Pokemon formula pay off considerably. With unique battling elements and engaging MMO structures, Temtem evolves as its own experience and offers a vast, challenging adventure that even those without a Nintendo console can enjoy. This was quite the positive review, but would sort of contradict CGM's review of the game, where they would give it a 6 out of 10 and state that the world needed more things to do. However, in fairness, the audience's initial reception seems to mimic more of the former's review, while over time shifting to the latter. On Steam, Temtem would initially score an impressive 89%, where player reviews would laud the game's cooperative main story, enjoyable gameplay, and well, make allusions or comparisons to it being an MMO. This was actually initially used positively in these reviews, but as I sort of already hinted at, eventually it would become a negative, as the expectations of the audience playing Temtem didn't seem to align with that of the developers. You could already see the signs or clues when observing a press release after the game's launch, where Crema Games would claim that they were primarily focused on overhauling the PvP content of the game, with the launch of the Showdown mode. They would even announce an accompanying competitive scene and pro scene, but no signs of announcements of new islands or even new Temtems, which had many fans already scratching their heads months in. The focus on PvP content was natural and totally acceptable, but no mention of PvE content made it seem like Crema Games was already transitioning out, as PvP content is usually the focus once that starts to happen, as it doesn't need constant new influxes of content to breathe life into the game, like PvE content does. Now, it might seem early, just a month after launch, but the game's story was only about 40 to 60 hours. If you took your time, that's completable after a month of just playing about 15 hours a week, which is only like 3 days of 5 hours of play. That might be a good value for $44, arguably, as a cooperative game especially, but for a supposed massively online game, that was kind of low value. I mean, Guild Wars 1, PSO, and Dragon's Dogma Online all had longer playtimes than that, and those games are also older, and the former more considerably. If the expectations of more were never placed on Temtem, say it was just like treated like a normal single-generation Pokemon single-player game with co-op play or whatever, could things have continued to grow larger and more ambitious from there? That's a serious question that we have to ask ourselves, and we might never know. Because it seems like the game fits that glove better than an MMORPG, let alone even just an online RPG, or like the baby virtual world. I mean, the game had a random sharding system that made it difficult to even play in the same channels as your friends or the same players in the same channel, period, right? Creating like a type of like community when you get used to that. This was a feature back in Guild Wars 1 that they pioneered in like 2005, where you could select exactly what channel you wanted to play in, skipping this issue altogether. Season 3 would add much wanted challenge modes to the game, adding a different way to beat the campaign and challenge yourself. This sort of stuff did wonders in making the game more replayable, but there was still little in the way of actual new content for the game, even just a few new Temtem, besides the couple mythicals they would add every now and then. If Crema Games didn't want to do any live developments, they probably should have made that clear, because it's quite clear it didn't really seem like they wanted to. Showdown wouldn't just be a mode featured within Temtem. It would actually get its own standalone client and be dubbed Temtem Showdown, where it would launch June 27, 2023. Playable on Steam for free, Temtem Showdown would allow players to not have to level up or catch their own Temtem, and instead pick from presets, sort of like Pokemon Stadium. The community reaction, however, was quite negative, in part because only like 20 people were even playing this new PvP version of the game, and the other part because it seemed like something that not a whole lot of the community was even asking for. As Massively OP would cover, the game director on Temtem, Guillermo Andrades, would push back, stating that the notion that Crema should focus on adding more monsters and zones and dojos to Temtem, arguing that those additions barely moved the player base needle during early access and thus were not sustainable. The thing is that those additions are promised on Kickstarter, meaning that you don't get to pat yourself on the back for them, and they shouldn't be the thing that you're using as a metric to judge new content. When it was early access, stuff meant to complete the game. You could have sold new islands and new content for money, and then tested from there. That's kind of the idea, right? That's what people wanted. Not to mention that the reason that adding new content can not move the needle, so to say, is because your player base is hemorrhaging its population. And the reason for that was reportedly due to the tacked-on grindy economy that kept many players from being able to afford housing in the game, proper Temtem that they wanted, and so on and so forth. He also says that developing the MMO was costly, and that the small bump of interest from monsters and zones would not be enough to cover the expense. Ironically, this Reddit comment would end up being later deleted, probably trying to cover the tracks regarding the MMO comparisons that would kind of become so toxic they wanted to shed them altogether. But it furthers my point that Temtem wasn't just sold wrongly, it was sold wrongly, and then when the developers were questioned about it, they would respond quite emotionally to the community, seemingly dismissing their concerns and desires. Andrades would further that the game's PvP community was big, and that Crema Games seemed happy with entrusting in that audience, over the actual majority audience for the rest of the game. I mean, the majority of the Temtem players I know are couples that played it just together for fun. I don't think that those players have any interest in PvP, and worse, a virtual world PvP without leveling and grinding really has only worked in the case of like Guild Wars. So maybe it could work, but that game's more focused on things like complexity and team fighting and ability builds. Temtem Showdown allowed you to do it all for free and literally bypassed the paid portion of the game. It was a bizarre business decision to say the least, and basically made it to where all PvP content in the game was done separately and for free. Season 5 would come alongside the introduction of the free Tem system, September 25th, 2023. The free Tem system is actually kind of hilarious. It's like Team Plasma from Pokemon, who wanted to free all Pokemon. The difference is they aren't the villains here. And to be fair, Team Plasma's kind of not the villains either. But you can do missions for them and get rewards by letting go of a certain amount of Temtems. The system is actually quite complex in idea, but unfortunately the actual execution was quite simple. Because imagine if players could let go of certain Temtem in certain regions as a collective and unlock certain drop rates for new rare Temtem. None of these sort of world ideas were even implemented into Temtem. And besides the game's story, the world itself had no story. It really felt like Temtem's real issues is just that people wanted it to be so much more. Sure, it was almost this Pokemon-like on PC, but it wasn't good enough to keep people playing it, especially when the dev team didn't seem interested in keeping players around either. Resisting returning to Pokemon, which has released now, at this point, 3 major mainline games since Temtem's launch, totaling at more than multi-dozens of millions of sales, is just a difficult proposition. And Crema Games didn't seem interested in being competitive in a race that they themselves willingly ran towards and entered. The apparent large PvP audience wasn't large enough, and Temtem Showdown, at least the standalone client, would be shut down altogether, January 2024. Worse, the competitive esports scene would also be shuttered after just a full season. Now, it's a running gag on the Death of a Game series about esports scenes failing and them being a major reason that, a particular game or company fails. But something we have to remark about here with the esports is the esports can't be forced. It needs to grow organically. And if you're building an esport, it needs to be exciting to watch. Temtem competitive isn't fun to watch. And the reason for that is because it's not made to be fun to watch. There's no pizzazz, there's no excitement in the viewing experience. It just shows matchups, shows movesets, and then players cycle through the moves in Temtem. There's no moments of cheering, big animations like in Stadium, or anything of that sort. It's a super sterile experience that likely doesn't capture anyone's interest who isn't already a big fan of PvP. And if you don't believe me, just look at the viewership. I have shitpost videos that I made as a 10-year-old that have more views. And Temtem specifically stated that their goal with Showdown and the comp scene was to make the game a household name. Okay, sorry. That doesn't really sound like a serious thing to say. But it shows how out of touch the dev team at Crema Games was with their own game, where they would confirm my point about the comp scene only attracting elite players from their own audience and little new players. The signs might have been there that Crema Games was looking to move on from Temtem, at least the game itself, but it still surprised many, myself included, when Crema Games would announce a spin-off game set in the same universe dubbed Temtem Swarm. A bullet heaven style game that focused on 3-player online co-op. This seemed like an attempt to follow the Vampire Survivor trend instead of actually putting more time back into Temtem, or a potential sequel, which was obviously far easier. The community would have quite the tepid response, like cool, yet another bullet heaven and hell game made by guys who just kind of seemed to want to abandon their other game. And just when the PR couldn't get any worse, and the community sabotaging was seemingly already bad, Crema Games would shoot themselves in the foot yet again by just being honest, apparently, when CEO Enrique Paños would state that the community expects to add infinite content, which is costly in terms of time and money, and just because it carries the MMO label, but MMO doesn't mean infinite. These are some juicy statements to investigate, detectives, so let's dive in. The CEO first admits that the game is an MMO here, then argues against the concept of the genre, continuous content and updates. Now, should MMOs forever release new content? I mean, not if it's not financially viable anymore, right? At least not officially. Let the community do it at that point. But here's the issue. Mr. CEO is acting like Temtem even fucking tried. Sorry about my French.
Fantastic language, especially to curse with.
Bear with me, guys. I know you like the whole detached detective, but the reality is that's no detective is like that. We're all opinionated, and we all hate certain things. And I hate when developers try to get credit for something that they didn't do. They made 2 content updates, launched the game, and then just stopped updating it, really. Some games from the 90s are still updating, like Lineage 1, which is a massively financially successful game. This idea that they were burnt out from the concept already, checks notes 0 months in, is just strange. Why even make an MMO, or more accurately an online RPG in the first place? Either of those games, being virtual worlds, are going to still need content. When we tried to introduce purely cosmetic microtransactions as a way to support us and extend the life of the game, we also received many negative criticisms. That's because your game had a box price, and only added new content during its early access period. Really? Content that it promised in its Kickstarter? Meaning if you had a plan for new content and were coming out with it regularly, monetization like that would make sense, but you weren't. And thus the CEO would argue this later on in the same conversation, that the game was already completed. Alright. The reception from this debacle was actually so bad that Crema would circle back and attempt to smooth things out, stating that they were still supporting Temtem and were not stopping their efforts to focus on it. But words like that are just words. When every single time that people start pressing you on it, you basically admit that you don't want to work on it anymore. Especially when the game now, even though it wasn't officially, already felt like it was in maintenance mode. Crema Games is an indie studio, who is also self-funded, besides the Humble Games publishing, of course. This means that they have to either rely on more publishing contracts like that, or pivot to other projects in an attempt to keep making money from new, fresh ideas or games. I defend indie game companies because of this, because it's in the nature of their company. However, that's not the same as holding water for developers moving on too soon or not doing a good job, of course. Anyway, early March 2024 and Crema Games would announce yet another project. And no, not Temtem Swarm either, but a new project almost likened to a sequel, but also not called a sequel, labeled Project Down Below, which would have features that they would reportedly want in a hypothetical sequel, but not be a sequel, so it's still a spin-off game. But the thing is do people even have faith in Crema Games to pull that off, even if it is a spin-off game? Especially with such a cartoonish lack of accountability for their mistakes or decisions already showcased publicly by them. And why would players support the effort anyway, when they really just wanted more Temtem, or just the game to get expanded, or a sequel? The reason that Crema wouldn't and couldn't do a sequel was because, as they would state, unfortunately the stakes are high and there aren't enough resources to achieve what the team would desire the sequel to be, and the sequel that you would deserve. Which is honestly a pretty soberingly honest response. Still, it begs the question, why not just shrink those ambitions or work on them a bit? Or just be honest. People know that you're a small developer, just promise episodic content that costs money, and that the support of it allows you to continue to expand the game, and then make more ambitious sequels. Like the Pokemon franchise. You know, that if you didn't want to do live development, that was always a model to follow. Instead, you're utilizing the IP built on this idea that gamers actually liked, but can't really enjoy that much anymore in an attempt to cash in on it, instead of actually treating it properly, and delivering what the audience would want. Maybe the spin-off game works because Crema does have some talent, but I have my doubts due to their actual management especially. Coming as not much of a surprise for most Temtem fans at this point, especially the more jaded ones who already quit long ago, was news that Temtem would be signaling the end of their development May 2024. No more new content and no more new updates for the game would come. Well, save some quality of life updates and the 2 upcoming planned updates. This was after months of debate between the community and the developers at Crema about what Temtem was supposed to be classified as. According to Crema, who would defend themselves, this issue being an issue didn't even make sense to them, because Temtem was incorrectly placed and tagged as an MMO on Steam, when it was planned to be more of like an MMO light, whatever the hell that is. They would then further explain that they had to shift the game to be more traditional MMO-like to meet those expectations, which caused Temtem to grow beyond their original intentions and grasp. And that they understood part of this was due to the fact that people were calling the game an MMO, which would lead to poor expectations. But I don't get it. It's not just the Steam tag that you somehow got cursed with. You put massive in your Kickstarter, and your CEO and director kept calling the game an MMO, which was confirming that idea, right? And to act like there wasn't a design path forward there, I mean, remember, Guild Wars 1 was putting out expansions year after year. Temtem fans had no issue with paying for content and paid expansions. They had an issue with these bare-bone microtransactions meant to make more money without providing any actual content in return. It wasn't a good value proposition. The community would respond to the community follow-up posts with pretty thoughtful advice and ideas of how Temtem could be better progressed. Temtem's community seemed pretty intelligent when compared to most, based on the feedback that I've seen on Reddit so far, and even more educated about possible pathways forward for Temtem than the developers were, But this isn't totally surprising. Crema Games was a talented small studio largely behind mobile games prior to this. We actually have no idea if any of the developers had any pedigree for virtual worlds, which is incredibly rare because, well, virtual worlds are incredibly rare and it takes a long time to work on them. Or being just a turbo nerd who played and studied so much of these virtual worlds that it becomes a skill that you develop and can't even sleep at night because of There wasn't any proof that they had the experience, which was probably the worst part of it all. When you don't have the experience, you don't have any idea how fast problems can start to occur, fester, and then create such a problem. In an attempt to deliver on the Kickstarter promises before leaving the scene, despite saying development was cancelled, was the release of the arcade bar June 10th, 2024. This was an area that allowed you to converse and hang out with other players and play new mini-games that were being introduced to the game, including top-down shooters and a side-scroller platformer. Problem is that this is the last part of the promise update for the Kickstarter, or at least the last piece of it, meaning at this point, 400 or so players was like the peak population. So nobody was even left to enjoy this new update, let alone socialize at the new location. This sort of stuff needed to be in the game from the jump to help create an environment that fostered sociality. Coming at the end just feels like something that they tacked on the things just to get it done with, and to satisfy those guarantees that you made. Temtem would receive 2 more updates with some quality of life changes and rank changes, and then nothing more. Things had finally dried up. Crema Games was ready to move on, or try to, as they would release the aforementioned Temtem Swarm November 2024. At only $8, Temtem Swarm was a relative success, managing to sell around 150,000 copies, but this was a far cry from Temtem's numbers. The population in Temtem would jump up during this time, perhaps due to some ability for some crossover to be created, or just have some returning players come back because they were hoping for new content. But within a few months, those numbers would drop back down to under 500 peak players. Temtem would continue to hobble on, despite celebrating that they had just reached 2 million total users by January of 2025, which was super impressive for an indie studio. But the time in the sun for the unlikely Pokemon alternative for the wanting PC audience had largely come and gone. And although Crema Games had intentions of moving on with the Temtem name, it seemed like many had moved on from them. That's what's so hard about competing with a titan like Pokemon. It's not just beating them once or twice. It's that they just launched nearly 5 games during the same time that Crema Games launched 1 game. Sure, you might win, like I said, 1 small victory, but unless you can establish yourself as something unique and different and, gobble up your own market share, whether through competition or that aforementioned uniqueness, you will eventually get drowned out again by the sheer amount of Pokemon content that exists, and not even just the games. That's where trying to be so much like Pokemon, except in a way that people didn't really ask for, 2v2 combat entirely being the focus and all, really ends up biting you in the rear. Ironically, another famous Japanese monster fighting game and series also made a similar mistake, Digimon. who also struggled to find their own identity after the popularity of Pokemon made them kind of shift to trying to copy off of them. Digimon would go from being one of the biggest franchises to being kind of relegated to like a side franchise, despite, in my opinion, having the better world design and concept. Difference being Digimon is still kicking, able to diversify enough and build upon its core in some ways. And Temtem, I hope they will still keep kicking, but with both games having less than 1,000 players combined, it doesn't seem like it's trending towards that direction. Unless Crema Games can really pull a rabbit out of the hat with their new project down below. Fans might be bitter, but they forgive when the quality is really good and unique. And remember, there wasn't really any Pokemon likes online on PC. Sorry, I always get carried away when that thing starts playing. But we have reached the end of the timeline and gathered more than enough clues and bits of evidence to diagnose why Temtem's development was discontinued. In case you missed any of the clues along the way, why did Temtem die? Misunderstanding of the genre, and suffering from the poor identity and issues that would stem from that. Lacking new content and new Temtem. A confusing and lackluster value offering of monetization. Poor community management and leadership. It was too Pokemon-like. Incredibly high expectations. Developers moved on to other projects. Pokemon is still the most popular franchise in the world, all these years later. That alone means that we will continue to see more games like it, on top of course, more Pokemon games, like Legends ZA coming later this year. But I really hope that the grandpas at Game Freak can get bit by the multiplayer bug, or at least the bigger bug, and express a desire in making a Pokemon game virtual, because it's going to be incredibly difficult to make one as an indie developer, or a developer without serious backing. That's where I kind of feel for Crema Games, really. They had such a good idea that grew to a point that they could barely even manage to develop it themselves. But unlike Among Us, which we just covered, a major success that wasn't really entirely expected, Temtem didn't reach overnight success. It was genuinely a good and wanted idea and game that grew over time. Crema just failed to deliver on that concept over time, and gave up on it even. People just didn't move on in a flash, they kept giving them time. They wanted more Temtem. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments below if you too would like to see a Pokemon online RPG or virtual world, and why you think Temtem ultimately floundered.